So let's play a little bit. Maybe we could say with the mind, but then test what these little anecdotes bring for us. You remember that simple story about the small boy, 7 years old, who goes to his father when his father's sitting in his armchair, reading his newspaper and drinking his beer after a hard day's work, and the child is asking questions like children do, why is the sky so high, etc., etc., etc. And the father gets very impatient with him, and he notices that on the page of the newspaper there's a picture of the globe, the world. And so he tears out that page and rips it all into small pieces and gives it to his small boy and says, "Take this and put it back together again." So the small boy goes away and he's back in just a couple of moments' time. And his father was very peeved. What happened? How did you do that? And the young boy said, "Well, I turned a piece of the paper over and I found a foot. And I realized it was a man, so when I put the man back together, the world came back together." And then the other day, I saw this wonderful little snip on, as we do on the internet, and it was about this, again, a small boy who was only 7 years old again, and he was given a Rubik's Cube. And he closed his eyes, and in a couple of moments, he put all that Rubik's Cube back together again, coherently, all the colors, all the pieces in place. It's since become a competition with others, how rapidly it can happen and so forth. But this young boy did it with his eyes closed and is winning all of these competitions when it comes down to making coherency out of what is incoherent. And then there's a little exploration that's been going on over these last days into archetypes. And it's always been known that, of course, Plato had always said that there are certain basic archetypes that make up our psyche. But now it's been listed and chronicled as to what these archetypes are, and it's certainly been found that the archetypes are universal. In one form or another, they are in every culture. So, of course, have to do with every psyche. But one thing that has been found, and that is universal, that the archetypal symbol for wholeness is a circle. Can be a mandala, it can be all kinds of other symbols and so forth. But basically, what has been found is that the universal symbol, archetype for wholeness is a circle. Now there's a story. Let's see where this story leads us, because it brings us right down to just a small facet of this psyche of ours. It's a story of a couple who had a child, a girl, who for some strange reason, and this name I don't know where it comes from, but her name was Widaya. So Widaya was a beautiful child, but when she came to the age of 7 years old, her mother had a fatal illness and was leaving this mortal realm. But the couple were very devoted to one another, and the wife said to her husband before she died, "Husband and beloved, I want you to promise me that you will not remarry until our daughter reaches a certain height." And she had her husband construct a piece of rope from the ceiling, which she had a globe of some kind put on it. And she said, I want you to wait until our daughter has reached the height where she can reach this globe, that you will not marry. So, of course, the husband was bereft, and he didn't find it difficult at all because of his loss to not look at another woman. But he was, of course, concerned about his daughter Widaya, and so he had her put under the tutelage of a woman who was a seamstress. And this seamstress was very adept at her trade and seemed to be a very fine woman. So the daughter Widaya came under her care, and she was very caring, and she taught Widaya the art of seamstressing, if that's a word. But after a while, of course, the seamstress had plans. She coveted, of course, being married to this man who would take care of her, so she nurtured Widaya and led her to a place where one day she knew of what had transpired between the husband and wife. She said, Widaya, come, stand on this chair and reach up. And so when Widaya did with her fingertip, she was just able to reach the top of the bottom of the globe. So the seamstress said to Widaya, well, now you go and tell your father that you've been able to reach this level, and so that will release him, recognizing that you've already reached that place. And so this is what Widaya did. She went back to her father and she said, Father, you know, I need a mother, and my teacher, the seamstress, is very kind to me, and you need a wife. And he reminded her, but the promise I made to your mother was that I would not remarry until you reached the place where you was able to touch them. And she said, but I did today, Father. And so, of course, this released the father from his vow with his wife, and so the wedding was arranged. He married the seamstress, and at first everything was very fine because the relationship had already been set up. But Widaya was growing into a very beautiful maiden. And the seamstress wife started to become very jealous of not only her beauty, but the attention that her husband, the father of Widaya, gave her. And of course this grew and grew in her until she came to the place where she decided that she would plot the death of Widaya. And so the next time the husband was to go away, while he was away, the stepmother said, come, we'll meet your father on his way back from his travels. So she took Widaya out into the desert, and she said, you wait here, I'll just go back for a moment. And she left and abandoned Widaya there in the middle of the desert. Now, as night was falling, of course, Widaya recognized that she'd been abandoned, and she grew very, very afraid. But as fate would have it, she found a little oasis where she was able to find water, and there was even a crust of bread floating on the water, so she had something to eat. But of course in middle of the night she was very afraid of wild animals that would come by, so she quickly climbed a tree. But while she was up that tree, she called. She beseeched. She called, "Father, Father, I've been abandoned. Won't you help me?" And as it happened, this was the route her father was taking from where he'd gone. So somehow he heard her pleas, and he answered them and found her. And she told the story about how she'd been abandoned. So the father said, "I have bought a chest of goods, silk and other gifts for my wife. Climb into this chest and take this needle. And when my wife opens the chest, prick her with this needle." And so this is what happened. The chest was brought back to the house. But of course, the stepmother had to admit that Widaya had died, because in the meantime she'd slaughtered a goat and covered it in a shroud and buried it. Now, when the husband heard this story and he asked, "Where is the body?" the stepmother said, "I can take you to the place where it is buried." But the father said, wait, I've bought a chest of goods for you from my travels." And so, of course, the stepmother, forgetting the feigning of her grief and so forth, was anxious to open the chest. And so she did, and of course was pricked with the needle and recoiled in fright. And the father said, "Look, what is in this chest?" And there was his daughter, Widaya. Of course, the stepmother was very, very distressed and afraid of what would happen now. And so it happened, of course, that with the neighbors who were invited, she was forced to go to the place where she'd buried the goat. And when it was taken out of that hole, and it was revealed that indeed it was a slaughtered goat, she had to face her fate. Now one can imagine what that fate would be, but that's not what the story is about. The stepmother had her fate. But what arises from this story in relationship to the anecdotes is, in this story, the story of a cruel stepmother, there's no doubt that all of us have read the other fairy stories about the cruel stepmothers, Cinderella and the like. There are many, many stories that contain this archetype, the cruel stepmother. So bringing it right down to the nitty-gritty now, the question is asked of us, what is this stepmother for us? This archetype of the cruel stepmother in our psyche. We've seen the sabotager. That's in many stories, and those several of them have been told. But the specific question today out of this story is, what is the meaning of the archetypal stepmother in us? Knowing that these stories all have the same kind of secret of jealousy, the growing anger and resentment, to wanting to get rid of that. What is it in us? What is this stepmother in us?
What comes to me is that if we understood that we are all part of one, there would be no jealousy of another, because there isn't another. And I certainly can recognise that in me. And so as we become closer to that grasping, that experiencing that we are all part of the one, that dissipates.
Yes. So you could say that these stories that are being told are an exploration, again, an inquiry. Aren't they? To answer these questions. What is this constant that's been in our life, unchanging? Where are we now? And what has this got to do with these anecdotes of wholeness and being whole? Is it like a hologram where all the parts contain the whole? Is it a whole that contains the parts like the mandalas and the circles, trees of life, all of those other things that the circles contain as a symbol of universality and wholeness?
Is it the part in us that makes us, tries to put us down and we're forced to break out?
Yes. Or trying to eschew, push them away or fight them, like we're considering they're demons, when they're basic aspects of our self, our basic aspects of our psyche that everyone has, like all the minerals that are in our body.